the birth of the church. So at least part of the Bible came before the church, the part that we refer to as the Old Testament. The books of the Old Testament, if you go by the ancient traditions of Judaism and Christianity, were written over a period of about 1,300 years or so, from around 1500 BC to about 200 BC or thereabouts. The ancient traditions of both Judaism and Christianity teach that Moses was the author of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. He was the author in that he would have been the first to write them down, or the first to order that they be written down. The contents of the book of Genesis, for example, were oral traditions that had been passed down for hundreds, if not thousands of years. Moses did not make them up. So he wasn't the author of Genesis in the sense that he created those stories, but he was the author in the sense that he caused those stories to be written down. Now, there are those who say Moses didn't actually author these books, that they weren't actually written down until several hundred years after Moses. Well, I'm not going to get into a convoluted argument about that, but it just makes sense to me that Moses, who was raised among the royalty of Egypt, that he would be the one to write these books down. You know, after all, the Egyptians had a system of writing, and they wrote all manner of things down. So Moses, having been around that for most of his life, well, it just makes sense to me that he would think, hey, when he got to leading the tribes of Israel, that he would think, hey, this stuff needs to be written down. Because that's what he was used to growing up in Egypt. They wrote important things down. That's why I personally have no problem at all believing that Moses was indeed the author of the first 5 books of the Bible. Fast forward several hundred years, and we get the last 3 books of the Bible. Malachi was written about 450 years before the birth of Christ. And 1st and 2nd Maccabees were written 100 to 200 years or so before the birth of Christ. So again, the Old Testament, as we have it today, was in existence before the birth of Christ, which means that it was in existence before the birth of the church. Now, some might say, well, but Israel was the Old Testament church. Well, yes, that's true. Just as the church is the New Testament Israel, the people of God. But when I talk about the church here tonight, I'm referring to the Christian church. Again, we know that part of the Bible, the Old Testament, existed before the church. But what about the New Testament? Did it exist before the church? Well, we have the answer to that in a couple of passages I've already mentioned tonight. Acts 2, verses 41 and 42, and Acts chapter 8, verse 3. In Acts 2, verses 41 and 42, it says this: So those who received his word, and again, this is referring to Peter's preaching on the day of Pentecost. So those who received his word were baptized, and there were added that day about 3,000 souls. And they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and fellowship, to the breaking of bread and the prayers. The early Christians, the very first Christians, devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and fellowship, to the breaking of bread and the prayers. Do you notice what this verse doesn't say they were doing? Reading the Bible. Does it say anywhere they devoted themselves to reading the Bible? No. Does it say they devoted themselves to reading the writings of Paul or of Peter or to reading the Gospels? No, they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching. Why doesn't this verse include the fact that they were reading the Bible? Because the Bible didn't exist, not as we have it today. The other passage that shows this is in Acts 8, verse 3, which says, But Saul laid waste the church. Now, how does Saul laying waste the church prove that the church came before the Bible? Well, Saul whose name was later changed to Paul, was laying waste to the church. He was persecuting the church, which means that the church was in existence before Saul, also later known as Paul, ever became a member of it. Yet it was this very same Saul who wrote 13 or possibly 14 of the books of the Bible. He may or may not have written the book of Hebrews. That's disputed among scholars. But he wrote at least 13 books of the Bible, which means he wrote his part of the Bible after he became a member of the church, after he was baptized. In other words, the Bible could not have existed before the church because Saul was persecuting the church before he ever wrote a single word of his very substantial part of the Bible. So I think we have sufficient evidence from the Bible to answer our question. Which came first, the church or the Bible? Well, again, if you didn't know the answer at the beginning of this talk, I hope you do now. The answer is pretty obvious. The church came first. The church had to come first. Without the church, there is no Bible. Without the church, there is no Bible. We can have the church without the Bible, but we cannot have the Bible without the church. The problem is, many non-Catholic Christians tend to think it's the other way around. They seem to think that if you've got the Bible, you don't need the church. At least not a church that is going to tell you how to read the Bible, or tell you anything about what the Bible means, or tell you about the proper way of interpreting the Bible. No, sir. They can read and interpret the Bible just fine for themselves, thank you. No need of a church. You know, when you think about that, when you think about individual interpretation of the Bible without any regard whatsoever for what the church says, when you really think about that, it's pretty much ridiculous. I mean, what if I wrote a book on some particular topic, and then one of you gathered here, bought that book, read it, and then came up to me and told me what that book was about? And I, as the author, told you, I'm sorry, but that's not at all what this book is about. And then you turned around and said back to me, well, you're wrong. I read it, and I have the right to interpret it for myself, and I'm telling you what this book is all about. Wouldn't that be pretty ridiculous? To tell the author of the book that he doesn't really know what the book that he wrote is about? That you, reading this book on your own, without consulting the author at all, know better than the author what this book is all about? That is absurdity. No one would do that, except when it comes to the Bible. When it comes to the Word of God, that is exactly what these folks who believe in going by the Bible alone are doing. They're ignoring the author of the book, and they're simply interpreting it by themselves without any parameters within which to interpret given to them, or they're not paying attention to any rules or regulations, you might say, with which to interpret the Bible accurately. The church authored the Bible. Well, let's refine that by saying that the church authored the New Testament, and it was the church that put the Bible together as we have it today, which I'll talk about more in just a minute. Yet when it comes to reading the Bible, most Protestants, whether they call themselves evangelicals, fundamentalists, non-denominationalists, Baptist, Methodist, Episcopalian, Presbyterian, etc., most Protestants believe that you don't have to pay any attention to what the church says when it comes to reading and interpreting the Bible. In other words, they don't believe you have to listen to the author of the book in order to truly understand the book.